Well, this is the study of the patriarchs, and the first patriarch was, his name was Abraham, and we looked a little bit about his introduction there another week, and his call that God gave to Abraham. And now, where did Abraham live before God called him to Canaan? Anybody know that? Other than Joseph, who's got a master of divinity, he should know that. All right, Joseph. Ur of Chaldees. Joseph, he's had a good schooling in this. He should know all these things, but I appreciate that. Ur of Chaldees. Now, where's Ur of Chaldees at? Is it like over there on the other side of Glenville, or where's it at?
Basically Iraq.
Yeah, well, yeah, down there, right close to the Persian Gulf, and right above Kuwait. Yeah, right in the Iraq area of the modern world. Ancient Babylon, that kind of a world. And God called him out of there, remember? And instead of, he took his father-in-law and his nephew and bunches of cattle and sheep, and they traveled up to, as we said, up the Euphrates River Valley and went all the way to Haran, and there they stayed. And they really wasn't supposed to, God didn't really call them to stay there, but they stayed there a few years, and then Abraham's father died. And then they worked their way down into what would be modern Canaan, the modern day Israel, and that's where God began to deal with Abraham on this world that he was going to live in. So we looked at his call. His call was to go there. God was going to bless him. It was the basis was what we call the Abrahamic covenant. And in chapter 12, we've got a few things in chapter 12 this evening to hit. And then we'll look at some things in survey chapter 13 and maybe 14, a little bit of survey in the night. After he gets into Canaan, the Lord appeared unto Abram again in verse 7, as you can see there. I got it underlined. Okay, and he said, unto thy seed will I give this land, and they're building an altar unto the Lord who appeared unto him. So now he's not only talking about he being blessed, but his seed. And that becomes the big thing with Abraham and his future, is this promised seed. And remember, Abraham's an older man, and his wife's older, but this was going to be a miraculous thing that was going to come forth with Sarai, or later Sarah, and they were going to have a son. They had their son down the road, Isaac. But at different times, God showed up to reassure him of his covenant. He's already been here a couple times with him and reassure him of this covenant. And another thing I would draw your attention to, Abraham was into building altars. And this is the first mention of the altar here. His first altar that he built there in the land. And where do you suppose he had the idea of an altar? That was something I know God had taught Adam, and we know about Noah, but they lived in a different world, so evidently that the understanding of that was being passed on to others. And Noah's children, they knew about it, about there's a God who needs to be worshipped, and you build an altar, and you sacrifice. An altar is a place of sacrifice, isn't it? So they would sacrifice a sheep or something on his altar, probably not understanding all the concept of what that pictured yet, because remember, God hadn't given the law yet. God hadn't written any of the word to us to know what that meant. But they understand that something innocent was dying in their place. And so he built an altar there. And then the Bible tells us he goes on to a place called Bethel. Now Bethel becomes sort of significant to Abraham. It becomes sort of a rallying point for his spiritual life. And here he builds another altar. So that was how he worshipped God, wasn't it? He understood the worship of the Lord. And he understood that there needed to be a blood sacrifice. Now, where he learned all this, we're not 100% sure, but through the passing down this knowledge from Noah to the sons of Noah, to even to the land where he lived, which was basically a pagan land, but there was some knowledge of this, and now back in Canaan, and he was learning of this. We don't know we know that God at this time on earth had a guy by the name of Melchizedek we're going to get introduced to before too long in our story. and he's called a priest. So God had a man of God, and we don't know where he first got introduced to Melchizedek. Could be Melchizedek himself could taught him some of these things, because we don't know. We know he meets him later on here, and seems to know him and things in chapter 14, and he's already offering up sacrifices and giving off an offering there to Melchizedek. So we see this already being in place in the life of Abraham, and he goes to Bethel. We'll get back to Bethel also shortly, because that's where Abraham gets back to. Now, there's an interesting part in the story, and some think this is probably a lack of faith in the life of Abraham. And this is what happens when a famine comes into the land in chapter 12, verse 10. Okay, remember, God called him to go to this land, and parts of the land was probably pretty fertile along the Jordan River basin, and all that is where most of the agriculture took place, and a lot of it was wilderness, but there must have been enough to take care of all of his animals and all these things. But a famine comes along, and evidently probably dries up a lot, and the vegetation begins to die, and so he leaves Canaan to go to Egypt. And it says in verse 10, and there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down into Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was grievous in the land. Now, first place, God, we don't have any recording where God says you need to go there. Okay? Now, this is the first mention of Egypt in the Bible, in this chapter. Now, Egypt becomes a very central focus in the Bible, both geographically and also symbolically. Egypt becomes a very symbolic place of a type of the world that you need to come out of Egypt. Egypt became, as a symbol, as I read here to you, an instance of, it became the type of the world, an instance of depending upon some human source or help apart from God. In fact, God in Isaiah says, woe to them to go down into Egypt for help, and trust in chariots and horsemen, and look not unto the Holy One, neither seek the Lord. So Egypt became this symbol of trusting in other things other than God. And right now, here goes Abraham down into this country. Of course, it becomes a very big part of the story later on when the children of Israel become enslaved into Egypt and then delivered from Egypt. It was a lot of things, a picture of Egypt in the Bible. And as far as the Christian in the New Testament, Egypt was sort of a symbol of the world. You don't go to the world for your good. You know, that was the pull of Israel. They was wanting to go back to Egypt. Even after they was out into slavery and coming out of there, at times they wanted to go back to Egypt. And that's always sort of a symbol of going back into the world. In the New Testament, as a Christian, don't go back into the world. Now the problem is, when he gets down here, some bad things begin to happen with Abraham. He gets down in this way, and he's worried that Pharaoh down there is going to want to take Sarah, his wife, to be his wife. And so he was afraid that, well, if he knew that Abraham was married to Sarah, well, you know, Pharaoh may kill Abraham and, you know, take Sarah. So he made up a half-truth that Sarah was his sister. And in those days, it was very strange under marriage arrangements, because she was actually a half-sister. So, very strange arrangements they had in those ancient days. And but that was not a truth. I mean, as we see him, he wasn't yet fully able to trust God. He had to trust on his own abilities. And so he goes down there and he makes this story up, and sure enough, the Pharaoh, so evidently, is taken to Sarah. Now, you got to understand, you know what, this was, Abraham must have been a pretty impressive person with all of his cattle and everything, his riches, to go down there and all of a sudden get the attention of Pharaoh. I mean, he surely wasn't just a vagabond coming through. And so he got Pharaoh's attention, and he likes Sarah, and Abraham told him this half-truth, which is a lie. And so he wants to take Sarah, but then God steps in and brings some plagues to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh wakes up and says, "Wait a minute! I think God's trying to get my attention here." And he said, Abraham, why did you lie to me? And he said, so you just get out of the land. You just get on back. And so basically, God used Pharaoh, this pagan guy, to sort of turn his son back here, Abraham, back into the land. Now, it opens up some interesting things there. If you have your book sometime you want to look at, there's the results of Abram's disobedience. There's a little sidebar in there. And here's some things. Let me just give you this because it's sort of just in general what sin can do. Okay, this is Abraham's sin. He lied in order to try to protect himself. But we understand Abram's still learning about God. There wasn't any of the Bible written, so Abram was on a journey of not only a physical journey getting to Canaan, he was on a spiritual journey. But even on our spiritual journeys, in our failures, we learn many things. This was a failure, and here's what the things that happened. Number one, he grieved God. Every time you sin, you grieve God. I don't care if it's now or in Abraham's day, sin grieves God. And there's different verses. If you have a book, you can go back and look at some of these verses. He weakened his own faith. One way we say this is he became a little bit of a pattern because he pulls the same trick out of the bag another time down the road. He should have learned from it, but he sort of pulls it back out again. Some believe he became a poor testimony to his nephew Lot because he was showing Lot that, you need to try to finagle a little bit to get around things. And of course, Lot had a great failure. We're going to look into the story later. That's the thing about sin. What it may do to you, this sin didn't destroy Abraham's life, but it could have influenced Lot, and sin did destroy his life and his family's life. And that's the one thing about sin. You may get involved with something, and it may not just completely destroy your life, but you may bring somebody else into it and completely just destroy their life. So possibility, Lot was influenced some by that. But that wasn't the only thing that influenced Lot, but that could have. He caused Pharaoh to be afflicted. Pharaoh was afflicted by this thing. And a big thing he got when he went to Egypt that really has changed the course of history, he brought a young woman back by the name of Hagar. If he wouldn't have went to Egypt, he wouldn't have brought Hagar back. And Hagar became a sort of a mistress type of a person to Abraham. He was married to Sarah. And here he brought another woman back, Hagar. And the story later on, we'll look at it when they couldn't have a child. And, he had a child with Hagar, which became Ishmael. And Ishmael became the father of all the modern Arab world, and they've been at war then. There's that war ever since. You just think 4,000 years ago, there was one incident that took place that might have opened up the door for all the conflict that we see today. It's when when we don't obey God, a lot of bad things can happen, not only now, but down the road. And that's, of course, sin always affects others. It always affects others. And so these are some of the things that the sin of Abraham there did. Now, he has to leave Egypt, so he comes back up out of there now. And it wasn't a good experience for him, and we don't know how long he was down there or anything. We don't know about the famine and all this kind of things. But it's a good thought here is we have much more revelation in our hands than what Abraham did. We got the Bible, we've got the dwelling Holy Spirit. We have a lot more tools to understand the will of God, I believe, to get a hold of this. But the principles we can learn through this part of it, God sent him to Canaan, and a famine came. Now, famine was a real big trial. Now, a trial doesn't mean that you need to move real quick. A trial is some way of testing our faith. What God was hoping probably with this famine, what God's desire is that Abraham would learn to depend upon him through the famine. Okay? Learn to depend on him through this difficult time. We don't have any recording of Abraham saying we need to pray to the God of heaven to get us through there. The only thing we do is, hey, let's get out of here, let's go to Egypt. A lot of times people move before they should into another situation because they feel, oh, this couldn't be God's will because we're having difficulties. Difficulties could be a test of your faith in that area. And so we learned that from this story there and his problem there in going to Egypt. Well, let's move over. I want to get to another chapter there because the story goes on in chapter 13. Now he goes back in verse 1, and Abram went out of Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot went with him into the south. And Abram was very rich in cattle and silver and gold. And he went on his journeys from his place, and here's the word Bethel again. So he gets back to Bethel, and unto the place where his tent had been at the beginning between Bethel and Hay, unto the place of the altar which he had made there first. And there Abraham called on the name of the Lord. Okay, here's a good formula. When you do mess up, get back with God. Okay? Get back with God. You know, the trip to Egypt was a disaster. Okay? Could you imagine all the work it took to get your group down there, to get your family down there, to get all those cattle down there? You get into it and you're trying to make up a story so you think you can survive, and the story doesn't pan out. It gets you into trouble. You get kicked out of Egypt, and he comes back in the famine, in the land that had a famine in it. But what do you need to do once you get back? Well, go back to God. He went back to Bethel. He got back there where he built his altar. There he got back on his knees and began to talk to the Lord again. You know, he should have spent time at the altar before he went to Egypt, but he didn't. But at least he knew where to go to. You know, a lot of times people be in God's church and they'll be walking with the Lord, and sometimes they get off track. They have an Egypt experience. You know, some difficulties come in, and boy, they leave the presence, and they leave the church. They go out and do this, and they go out and do that, and all of a sudden their big plans go haywire, and all of a sudden the things didn't go too good, and their family has a problem, and the things begin to dissolve around them. Their job didn't work out, all this stuff, and they come back and they're wondering what happened. What should I do? Well, go back to where you knew you first had a relationship with God, a place with God, a meeting with God, a church, the people of God. You come on back. You know, a lot of times people think, well, I can't come on back. You need to come on back. Abraham went back to Bethel. He wanted to go back there where he worshiped the Lord. He wanted to go back there where he could talk to God again. He felt comfortable there. And he felt comfortable to worship the Lord again. God was forgiving. God was a forgiving God. We see God's forgiveness here. Before any of the scriptures was written about God's forgiveness, we could see this in place here. Because sometimes when Abraham messed up, God didn't say, Abraham, you really blew it. I should have picked somebody else. I'm going to kick you out of here. No, God was very forgiving and restoring with Abraham's life. Not just time. There was other things in the life. There was the incidents with Hagar. There was other incidents. And along, God just kept saying, Abraham, you got to learn. You know, God was just, you got to learn these truths. And he kept forgiving and kept directing him. He didn't spare him from consequences of your actions. Consequences are there, but he didn't kick him out of the covenant was made, the promises were made, and God kept him there. So he went back to Bethel, and there he had a good worship time with God. And in fact, we see where God shows up again. Let me go on down to. Well, let me go first before I get to where God spoke to him again. We see some strife begin to come between Abraham's group and Lot's group. This is going to be a significant event because it's going to separate Abraham and Lot. Now, they came together, and by this time, Lot had a big herd. Abraham had a big herd, and you know they each had people trained to take care of them, but they began to run into some problems with having these herds together, and there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's cattle and the herdsmen of Lot's cattle. And so here we see an interesting characteristic of Abraham. He was the elder of the family. He was really the one who could have said anything he wanted to Lot, and had to follow through with it. He could have said, Lot, I want you to get your cattle and your sheep, and you go down that way. I don't care if there's not any, you just go. Abraham was a very gracious man, wasn't he? And he's a very man of love toward his nephew here, because what he says, Abram said to Lot, let there be no strife, I pray thee, between me and thee, and between my herdsmen and thy herdsmen, for we be brethren. Is not the whole land before thee? Separate thyself, I pray thee, from me, and if thou wilt take the left hand, I will go to the right. If thou wilt depart to the right hand, I will go to the left. In a very unusual move, Abraham, the very gracious man, says, Lot, you choose a place to take your cattle, and you take them, and God bless you, and I'll take the other side. That was very gracious for him to do that. We see that characteristic in him, and that's very pleasing to God. So Lot, though, we begin to see that I believe his heart was beginning to wander into the paganism, and Lot lifted up his eyes. And that was his problem. He lifted up his eyes into the wrong place and beheld all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. So Lot didn't hesitate taking the best land. The plains of Jordan, the Jordan River is where the water supply is, and that's where if you look on a map, and there'll be a bunch of brown area, and you'll see a river, and around that it's called colored green, because that's where the water supply is. If you look at Africa, there's a big brown spot, and then right to Nile, the big green. Where the rivers are is where the abundance of vegetation is. And Lot said, okay, I'll take it, Uncle. So, okay. And God says, okay. And he says, take it. But he goes. But he says, this was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, which is a timetable there for us to understand. And Lot chose this. And down in verse 12, and Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of plain and pitched his tent towards Sodom. That's the real big phrase there. He decided, I want to go where all this action in Sodom is. I've heard about big things happening there. I heard that's where things are really happening in the business world. That's the social interaction. I mean, I've got a family, and we've got to have some social outlets, and and my wife probably likes the best wardrobes, and go out here in Canaan where Abraham lives. There's nothing but a bunch of hicks out there. I want to move into the city. I want to be a city folk. But God tells us there in verse 8, but the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. That was the problem with Sodom. Sometimes when we make our choices, it's not just, I don't know what all he was considering. He was considering the economic issues. He thought about that. He was considering the social light of where the city would bring in. And it's like many times today, maybe parents or families would choose, this is the best place for education, this is the best place for this. But how many people, if you're a Christian, you should consider, is it a place where I can really worship God? Is there a church there that's really being used of the Lord that I can be a part of? And see, Lot wasn't concerned about those things. He was looking at other things. And all this was going to be a downfall for Lot. This was going to destroy his family. This was going to take him down. So we get to that story later on in the story, but this is the beginning of that, an introduction that he went to Sodom. He went to this city, Sodom and his neighboring city, Gomorrah, and there he thought, that will bring happiness to my family. That will bring prosperity to my family. But what did we find out? It didn't bring happiness. It didn't bring prosperity. It brought devastation. It brought destruction. And so there's a great lesson in there. Now verse 14 tells us God again appears to him, and I think this is the third time the Lord appeared to Abram. And the Lord has said unto Abram, after that Lot was separated from him, lift up now thine eyes and look from the place where thou art, northward and southward, eastward and westward. For the land which thou seest, to thee will I give it thee, and thy seed forever. And I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth. And so here's this, he says, you just rise up and walk in the land. Whatever you walk in, that'll be your land. So the third time now God comes. Now there's times when the Lord just sort of shows up to him with direct revelation. There's times we don't see that. There's times he does. But it's always the assurance about his call. His call to this land, his promise of a seed, his promise of future generations having this. That was this Abrahamic covenant. And he wanted to make sure that Abraham knew this and believed that and was settled on that he would know that God was going to fulfill his promise. And this thing with the seed, that was going to be the big thing in his life, because he was up in his 70s, and and it was going to be another 25 years before this child was born. And from the first time he started mentioning to it would be 25 years. And so this was going to be this thing. He says, "Oh, Abraham, you're going to have children that's more plentiful than the sand of the seashore." And he looks at there, well, just me and my old wife Sarah, just me and her. What do you mean, God? Just believe me, just trust me. Well, okay. And it went on and on and on, and eventually, and here it is, 4,000 years from then. And surely, how many people from the Jewish race has been scattered all over the world? Many people. Is there any other nations I really don't know of that goes back 4,000 years that are still in full, what do you call it, function? Just Israel. And so here, 4,000 years later, these things are still being fulfilled. And we see a great promise given there. Now, I want to just give one more thing in chapter 14 as we survey that chapter, because after Lot goes down there, a war breaks out. Okay, just like 4,000 years ago, the Middle East was in war. Today it's in war. So we find there's war going on. And this is actually the first recorded war of the Bible we have here. And this is the first recorded war. In Revelation 19, and the future is the last recorded war. So the Bible has this. There's a little sidebar in your notes, if you got those, you want to read it there sometime, about peace in human history. Listen to this. The Society of International Law, London, has pointed out there has been only 268 years of peace during the past 4,000 years of human history. Despite the signing of more than 8,000 separate peace treaties, at the UN, an inscription quoted Micah 4:3, "And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up a sword against nation, neither shall they learn war no more." This, of course, will not be realized. This, of course, will be realized some glorious day, but not until the Prince of Peace comes to reign on this earth. Until then, the United Nations would have been more accurate to quote the words of Joel 3:9 and 10. "Proclaim ye this among the Gentiles, prepare war, wake up the mighty men, let all the men of war draw near, let them come up, beat your plowshares into swords and your pruning hooks into spears." That's what has been until Jesus comes back, is times of war. Just think, only 268 years of peace and 4,000 years of human history since the time of Abraham. Wars has been a part of why. Men is just the nature of men. It's the nature of conflict. We see that all around us. And I know the ones in this room, they can go back since the 1930s. How many years of peace has there been since then? Well, very few years. I mean, even our own country's been in war many years, not alone all the other wars around the world. But anyway, a war breaks out, and there was 9 different nations in it. There was a group of people with their allies. They got together against a group of people from the allies of the Sodom area, and they went in and they defeated Sodom and Gomorrah, and they took the spoils of the city, and they took the people captive. Now, as has been noted, I wonder why, about the only reason that this comes out in the scriptures, I mean, other than, Sodom and Gomorrah and all these wars and all these cities, they've been fighting all the time. Well, why did God bring this up in the scriptures? Well, it's because of this one verse in verse 12, "And they took Lot." Lot was one of God's children. Okay? Now that's the thing to understand. We know throughout the scriptures that Lot, although he didn't act like a very righteous person, had become a person of God. The New Testament calls him righteous Lot. Now, he didn't act too righteous. He's like a Christian sometimes that doesn't necessarily act righteous. But he but he was one of God's children. And they took Lot. So the news gets back to Abraham then that, hey, there's been a war over there, and your nephew's been, and his family's been captured. Well, what does an old cattle farmer like Abraham does? He's very multi-talented. We go down to verse 14. And when Abram heard that his brother, and really it's not talking about his physical brother, his family, his nephew, was taken captive, he armed his trained servants. He said, all right, guys, put down the pitchforks and let's get the swords. And so he had 318 servants. So he had a lot of servants. That's a pretty good group of people. And so he says, we're going to go to war. So imagine, this is what the armies was at that day. Whatever, we got our farmers and we got our pitchforks down, we got our swords in our hands now, and we're ready to go. You had to provide your own security, didn't they? A couple things about Abraham that reveals in this. First of all, he was a man of sympathy. And by the means of this, he could have said to old Lot, well, it serves him right. He shouldn't have went down there to Lot. He shouldn't have went to old Sodom anywhere. That's a bunch of wicked people. Maybe if he spends a little time down there in some foreign prison, he'll learn his lesson. How many of us probably did that job before, but he didn't do that. And also, he was prepared. He had armed and trained servants. He was prepared for a lot of things. He was prepared physically, emotionally, spiritually. Abraham was one of these people in the Bible. You think of why God maybe chose Abraham. There's a lot of things that you could see him in his life. He was a man he managed people. He had compassion. He was willing to go back to God when he failed. There's a lot of good traits in Abraham as we see his story unfolding in the scriptures, as we see why God picked this man. Well, I'm not going to go through. I'm going to pick up some of this story next week, and this is where we'll get introduced to Melchizedek later on. But the thing is, Abraham took a group of people that he had that could go out and capture this group from this foreign army and this other city, and take back his Lot and his family, and actually rescue the other people. So Abraham's now a war hero. Okay, he's a farmer, he's a man of God, he's a general, he's everything wrapped up in one, and that's the reason he's one of the great people of the Bible. Abraham is that type of person that we learn from. Great things to learn from Abraham as we study the scriptures. He lived 4,000 years ago, and there's a lot of things that we'll never do that Abraham did, but there's a lot of traits that we can learn from him and his life if we're willing to put it in the use in ours. I'm going to stop here this evening. We'll pick up next time in chapter 14 there. We're going to see the introduction to a very important person of the Bible, and that's Melchizedek.